a lot of people say that, I mean, obviously, Vladimir Putin says that part of the reason the invasion had to happen is because of security concerns over the expansion of NATO. And there is a lot of people that say that this was provoked by NATO. Do you think there's some legitimacy to that case?
Look, I think the whole situation here is very complicated, and you have to take a much longer view than, what happened in, 2008 with the open door for Ukraine and Georgia, which actually, by the way, I thought was a strategic blunder, just to be very clear, because there wasn't any kind of thinking through about what the implications of that would be and, what it actually would mean for Ukraine's security. And also bearing in mind what, Putin had already said about NATO expansion. They came on the wake of the recognition by the United States pretty unilaterally of Kosovo. And it also comes in the wake of what I mentioned before, the invasion of Iraq, which really becomes very important for understanding Putin's psyche. So I think, we have to go back, much further than it's not just talking about kind of NATO and what that means. NATO is part of the whole package of Ukraine going in a different direction from Russia, just as so is the European Union. Remember, the annexation of Crimea comes after Ukraine has sought an association agreement with the European Union, not with NATO at that particular point, even though, the EU on the common security and defence policy basically has all kinds of connections with NATO at, various different levels in European security front. It was all about Europe and going on a different economic and political and ultimately legal path, because if you have an association agreement, eventually you get into the acquis communautaire, and it just transforms the country completely, and Ukraine is no longer the Ukraine of the Soviet period or the Russian Empire period. It becomes, on a different trajectory, like Czech Republic, Slovakia, Poland, another country. It becomes a different place. It moves into a different space, and that's part of it. But if you go back again to the period at the very beginning of the 1990s, after the dissolution of the Soviet Union, well, there's no discussion about NATO at that point and NATO enlargement. There is a lot of pressure, again, as I've said before, by nationalist elements on Ukraine trying to bring it back in the fold and wanting to make what was then, this mechanism for divorce more of a mechanism for remarriage, the Commonwealth of Independent States. And in the early 1990s, when Ukraine became an independent state, it inherited that nuclear arsenal from the Soviet Union. Basically, whatever was stationed or positioned in Ukrainian territory at the time became Ukraine's. Strategic and, kind of basically intermediate and tactical nuclear weapons. And, in the United States at the time, we had all this panic about what was going to happen with all of that. I mean, I think, as a scientist and, kind of technically it would have been difficult for Ukraine to actually use this. I mean, the targeting was, done centrally. They were actually stationed there, but nonetheless, Ukraine, like Belarus and Kazakhstan, suddenly became nuclear powers. And, Ash Carter, the former US Defense Secretary, who's just died tragically, and Dave was talking about, talking together today, was part of a whole team of Americans and others who, tried to work with Ukraine, Belarus, and Kazakhstan to get them to give up the nuclear weapons. And back in the early period of that, 93, 94, you go back, and I was writing about this at the time. I wrote a report called Back in the USSR, which is, kind of on the website of the Kennedy School with some other colleagues. And we were monitoring how there was all these accusations coming out of Moscow, the defense ministry and the Duma, the parliament and others, that Ukraine was trying to find a way of making a dirty bomb, using its nuclear weapons, becoming a menace. And, kind of Ukraine might have to be brought to order. So a lot of the dynamics we're seeing now were happening then, irrespective of NATO. Basically, the problem was always Ukraine getting away. Yeltsin himself, when he unraveled the Soviet Union, didn't really want it to unravel, but he didn't have the wherewithal to bring, the countries back again. Russia was weak after the collapse of the Soviet Union. Its economy imploded. It had to give sovereignty to all of these constituent parts of the Russian Federation in terms of a sort of devolution of authority. It had the war in Chechnya, which Yeltsin stupidly sparked off in 1994. You had Tatarstan, one of the regions, the all rich regions, basically resting out a kind of a bilateral treaty with Moscow. The whole place was kind of seemed like it was falling apart, so that, you couldn't do anything on Ukraine because you didn't have the wherewithal to do it. And then when, kind of basically Russia starts to get its act back together again, all of these security nationalist types who had never wanted Ukraine or Belarus or Moldova or anywhere else to kind of move away, they didn't worry that much about Central Asia, to be frank, but they did want, the core states in their view to come back, and Moldova was part of that, even if it's not Slavic, but they wanted Belarus and northern Kazakhstan, and probably Kazakhstan as well, which wasn't really thought about being as part of Central Asia, back in the fold as close as possible. So anything that gave those countries an alternative was seen as negative. It could have been an association with China, them joining, kind of an association with Latin America or Africa or something else like that. But of course, NATO has all of those larger connotations of it being, the Cold War opposing entity. And Putin has always seen NATO as being the direct correlation of the Warsaw Pact, which is, in other words, just something dominated completely by the United States. Now, that, of course, is why, getting back to Trump again, Trump was always going, to the Europeans, if this is really supposed to be collective security and a mutual defense pact, why are you guys not paying? Why does the United States pay for everything? But, NATO was actually conceived as collective defense, mutual security. And it was set up by, the United States, along with the UK and France and, Germany and Turkey and, other countries. And we see that now with the entry of Finland and Sweden. They didn't have to join NATO. They didn't want to join NATO for a long time. They wanted to partner with it, just like Israel and other countries partner with NATO. But once they thought that their security was really at risk, they wanted to be part of it. And so, you're now really seeing, that NATO is something other than just being, a creature or an instrument of the United States. But that's how Putin always saw it. So, what this debate about NATO is all about, or Russia being provoked, is wanting to kind of return to an old superpower bipolar relationship where everything is negotiated with the United States. It's to try to deny that Ukraine or Belarus has kind of been absorbed by this point, by Russia, or Moldova or Kazakhstan or any of the other countries have any kind of agency, or even Poland or Hungary or, kind of France and Britain. For years and years and years, senior people like Putin and people around the Kremlin have demanded a return to the kind of what they call the old concert of Europe, or the concert of Vienna, where the big guys, which now means the United States and Russia, just sit down and thrash everything out. And so, Putin, by saying, look, it was provoked, it's the United States, it's NATO, it's a proxy war, or it's this or it's that, or this is going to be a nuclear confrontation. It's like the Cuban Missile Crisis, or it's the Euro Missile Crisis. It's basically just saying, I want to go back to when the Soviet Union and the United States worked things out. I want to go back to the whole, period of the 1980s when Gorbachev and Reagan just kind of got together and figured things out. Or, even better, back to Yalta, Potsdam and Tehran and the big, meetings at the end of World War II, where we resolved the whole future security. We've had a war, we've had the Cold War. Now we've got another war. We've got a real war, hot war. We've got a war in Ukraine. It should be the United States and Russia that sort this out. So this is where we see the United States waffling about as well, trying to kind of figure out how to handle this, because it has to be handled in a way that Ukraine has agency. Because if Ukraine doesn't have agency, then nobody else has agency either. Nobody else has any kind of decision-making power. And, we have an environment in which Putin thinks that there's only really three players. There's the United States and Russia and China. And maybe occasionally it might be India and perhaps Brazil or some other, South Africa or some other country, like maybe the BRICS at some point. But, ultimately, it's like the old days. Big powers resolve everything. And so this war is also about Russia's right, Putin's right, to determine things, strong man to strong man, big country to big country, and, determine, where things happen next. That's why he's talking about things being provoked and it's being the United States' fault.
But aren't there parts of the United States establishment that likes that kind of three-party view of the world?
Oh, there's always going to be people who like that approach. Of course there is. But then they don't necessarily dominate. That's the kind of thing that people kind of think about. Putin can, read, all the various articles and hear the kind of pronouncements of people. But, this gets back to, the way that the United States operates. Putin saw that, Trump wanted to have a, top-down, vertical of power. And other presidents have wanted to have that. But the United States is a pretty messy place. And we have all kinds of different viewpoints. Now, of course, we know that in Russia, everything, even criticism of the Kremlin, is usually fairly orchestrated, usually to kind of flesh out, what people think about things. When we had these hardliners saying, we needed more destruction of Ukraine, not less, and that, the army wasn't doing enough, it was in many respects, kind of encouraged by the Kremlin to see how people would react to that, to kind of actually create a constituency for, being more ruthless than you had before, because, they wanted to clamp down. In the United States, I can say whatever I want. It doesn't mean that I'm speaking on behalf of the White House. And, even if I have been an advisor to this president, that president, and the other, it doesn't mean I'm, basically speaking on behalf of the US government. But there's kind of always an assumption from the Russians that, when people, say this and people do advocate one thing or over another, that they're, it's operating. There's a lot of mirror imaging, thinking that, we're operating in the same kind of way. So yes, there are, of course, constituencies who think like that and would love it, to be back to that. And there are many people out there with their own peace plans. All kinds of people, out there trying to push this.
There does seem to be the engine of the military-industrial complex seems to give some fuel to the hawks, and they seem to create momentum in government.
Yeah, but other people do too. There's always, kind of a checks. Again,
you believe in the tension of ideas.
I think there is a lot of tension. I've seen it. I've seen it inside of the government now, and people can push back. And that's why I speak out and I try to lay it out so that everybody can, kind of figure it out for themselves. I say the same to you as I say to everybody. This is how I see the situation. And, this is, how we can analyze it here. Now, look, do I think that we've handled, the whole Russia account, for years? Well, no, we haven't. We've taken our eyes off the ball many times. We've failed to understand the way that people like Putin think. You talked earlier about, we need to have empathy for, all the people who like Trump or like Biden and understand how they think. We've got to have strategic empathy about Putin as well. We've got to understand how the guy thinks and why he thinks like he does. He has got his own context and his own frame and his own rationale. And he is rational. He is a rational actor in his own context. We've got to understand that. We've got to understand that he would take offense at something and he would take action over something. It doesn't mean to say that, we are necessarily to blame by taking actions, but we are to blame when we don't understand the consequences of things that we do and act accordingly, or, take preventative action or recognize that something might happen as a result of something.